Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. Tomorrow, the Nuclear Suppliers Group starts a two-day plenary meeting in Seoul, and India's hope of being admitted hinges critically on a consensus being reached between now and Friday. But can India overcome China's objection? What about other countries like Turkey, Ireland, Austria and New Zealand? How much help and support can we expect from President Obama? And what happens if we fail to become members? Those are the key questions we shall address tonight, 24 hours before the Seoul meeting. But we begin by asking a fundamental question. Why is it important to join the NSG, or is that quest misplaced and mistaken? My guests are India's former ambassador to France and an expert on disarmament, Rakesh Sood, India's former High Commissioner to South Africa and Pakistan, Satyabrat Pal, the founding editor of TheWire.in, Siddharth Vardarajan, and a fellow of Brookings India, Dhruv Jaishankar. Rakesh Sood, let's start with the question, is it really in India's interest to join the NSG before we come to an assessment of the likelihood of success at Seoul tomorrow and day after? Why do you believe it's important for India to join the NSG?
Well, in practical terms, to further our civil nuclear cooperation, we don't need to be a member of the NSG, because we have a special waiver which India was granted in 2008, and pursuant to that we have signed nearly a dozen agreements pertaining to civilian nuclear cooperation, supply of uranium as a fuel, and so on.
Precisely why I asked the question. So why is it so important to join?
However, what we have done is we have declared voluntary adherence to NSG. In other words, were NSG to change its decisions tomorrow, were it to add new materials to its control lists or new procedures, we would automatically, voluntarily adhere to it. To be part of that decision making, if that is important for us, that is the key. That is why we are seeking the membership.
So what you're saying
it's
is because we've committed ourselves to accept any changes the NSG makes, even when we're not members of the NSG, right, it's better to be inside, involved in the changes, because we're committed to accepting them.
Absolutely.
Satyabrat Pal, you've argued almost the precise opposite in a recent piece for TheWire.in. You say India's manic quest to join the NSG is misplaced. Why do you believe that?
I agree completely with Rakesh that you don't need it because of the special waiver. And what are you going to get from it? As Rakesh says, if new rules are going to be made, if the old rules are going to be changed. Well, the old rules have been changed, and the NSG changes its rules about once every 15 years. And the changes were last made in 2013. They introduced a rather fundamental change which altered the terms of the waiver that we got. Now it's going to be absolutely impossible for us, and that is the key change.
And that change was a denial of enrichment and reprocessing facilities to a country like India.
Because we are not a member of the NPT. And if we became a member of the NSG, we would be the only country not a member of the NPT. So that having been already instituted in the rules of the NSG, circulated by the IAEA, whether we become a member or not makes no difference at all.
And therefore you're saying that this quest and the effort we're putting into it, to quote the headline of your article, is misplaced?
Completely, absolutely.
Dhruv Jaishankar, how do you respond to the argument you've heard from Satyabrat Pal that first of all, India has nothing to gain by joining the NSG after securing a waiver in 2008, and secondly, although he hasn't quite made that point but he's made it elsewhere, the very process of trying to join is now reinserting the hyphen between India and Pakistan, which the waiver in 2008 had removed. In other words, we're undoing the good work we did in 2008.
Well, there are two parts to that question. On the first part, just to address some of the importance, I would actually say the importance is perhaps greater. Largely it's political, as Ambassador Sood said, but I think even the practical consequences. Does India want to be content just abiding by rules created by others, or does it want to actually be active in shaping those rules? And I think India, given its stature, given its history, given its the steps that it has taken already, certainly sees itself as a rule maker now. So I think that is a fundamental difference. This is why membership is partly important. The second is, in fact, India has the NSG was created after India's 1974 nuclear test, and there is a legacy of sanctions. Effectively, joining the NSG is a form of sanctions proofing. And I think that is something important to stress. There's also the political argument. and that's one that I've made, which is even if you argue that the NSG itself is not that important, the fact that China is going to such extent, not just China, but China in particular, is going to such extent to block India is itself important. India needs to join simply because there is such vehement opposition to its inclusion. If it can't join this, how can India expect to join much more important forums of global governance?
I want to bring up with you a point that you made in an article that I believe is due to be printed soon about how this entire effort to join the NSG at the moment is reintroducing a hyphen between India and Pakistan, which the waiver which we were granted in 2008 had actually removed. In other words, we're undoing the good work we achieved in 2008. Just explain that in a bit of detail to the audience quickly.
Well, simply because the waiver made us unique. No other country that is not a member of the NPT has been granted the waiver that the NSG granted us in 2008. Pakistan at that stage specifically asked for the same facility to be given to it, and it was specifically rejected. Now, having got that waiver, we are in a position that is unique. Pakistan simply doesn't have a chance of getting that. The moment we apply for membership, Pakistan is applied too.
So we're back on the same level.
We're back on the same level, and China is raising the point because of the objection to India, because it wants to get Pakistan in.
Siddharth Varadarajan, leaks or sources, depending upon how you interpret them, in at least 2 newspapers yesterday suggested that India was going to strain every muscle to get into the NSG, because this shows, first of all, a new self-assurance, and secondly, that India is no longer scared of failure. And what was being suggested was that the timidity of Indian foreign policy in the past was now behind us, it had been outgrown. How do you respond to that interpretation of the need to get into the NSG?
Well, I think the charge of timidity is an unfair one, because the legacy of, what the BJP government or the NDA is trying to do now is to build on something that the previous government did, and they've often some of them have spoken about it. The fact is that you would not be knocking at the NSG's doors today were it not for all the heavy lifting that was done from 2005 to 2014. The fact is that for the negotiators of the original deal, they were not overly concerned about insisting on NSG membership, for the simple reason that in the waiver that the NSG granted, a clause was put in that there was language about the need for consultation, and language suggestive of India's ability to abide by any new guidelines being contingent on a process of consultation. I think that was felt as giving the country enough cover. Of course, in 2010, when Obama raised it, the Manmohan Singh government said yes, we would be happy to be members of the NSG. But I think the issue really was, what are you going to give up in exchange? What's the cost-benefit ratio analysis that you're doing? And I think somewhere down the line, this government made a political calculation rather than a strategic or a diplomatic one.
Okay.
And I think having done that, having overplayed its hand, it's now scrambling to ensure that what emerges from Seoul is something positive. There's talk of some kind of a face-saving formula.
Let's not jump ahead of ourselves. What emerges from Seoul, I'll come to in a moment's time. I'm interrupting you. I want you to respond to the leaks in the papers, and they're inspired leaks from sources inside the MEA. They aren't leaks that newspaper journalists have cooked up. That this is an important effort because it suggests that the timidity of the past is over. It's an important effort because it suggests a new self-assurance in Indian foreign policy. As one paper put it, it shows that India is no longer scared of failure. Respond to that.
Look, this is self-serving guff, because the fact is that I don't think the previous government, insofar as the way the nuclear deal emerged finally, could be accused of timidity. So what is it? So they're laying a false charge and perhaps claiming false glory. It's important that there not be political drivers to this process, and I'm afraid somewhere down the line the Prime Minister and his advisors are making political calculations instead of strategic and diplomatic ones, and I think that's part of the problem.
Rakesh Sood, let's now come to the likelihood of success at Seoul. And before we come to details, and I will come to the details in a moment's time, let me ask you a very simple question. Even in 2008, when we got the waiver, India had to literally go down the line before it happened. And then eventually we pulled it off. I believe the story is with a note given to India at the breakfast table to say that China had dropped its objection. Do you think India can pull it off again at the last moment, or is that unlikely?
Well, at that time, I mean, as Chateau said, but the Pakistani application for a waiver was not there at that time. The only application that was under consideration was the Indian application. This time, the key difference is that there are two applications. And if we've seen, Sartaj Aziz, I think, has been very transparent in the interviews that he's been giving, because he said that we waited. In fact, he said we had our application ready 3 months earlier, but we waited till India put in its application and immediately followed thereafter.
So you're saying the fact that there's a Pakistani application alongside the Indian makes it more difficult to accept the Indian? Or the Indian only?
And then subsequently, if you saw yesterday in Parliament, he announced that we have successfully blocked India. So the short point I'm making is that Pakistan putting in its application was obviously something that had to be coordinated with China, and it was therefore put in, and hence the Chinese position that has evolved in terms of bringing up NPT and so on.
So is
as
your
a delaying
conclusion?
tactic.
So is your conclusion that this time it will be more difficult than 2008?
For China to find a face saver.
Which means, of course, Satyabhat, that the critical obstacle is China. Do you believe that the new position that Beijing enunciated yesterday, and I'm quoting them, the door is open for discussion for the admission of all NPT countries, suggests a small but important change in India's favor? Or do you believe the fact that today in a statement China has once again reiterated that the matter is not on the NSG agenda at all, means that the Chinese reluctance, the Chinese obstacle remains as firm and as irremovable as it was?
I think at the moment the Chinese are playing hardball as they might be expected to do, and precisely because Pakistan's application is on the table, China will insist that if India is to be brought in, so must Pakistan. And on this, they would say that the credentials are exactly the same. Neither is a party to the NPT, and therefore if you let one non-NPT member in, you must let the other in as well.
The credentials may be the same in the sense that both India and Pakistan are not members of the NPT, but Pakistan's preparedness to join is a lot less than ours. They haven't done their separation between civil and nuclear, they haven't done the additional protocol. So do you think it's possible that the NSG, under Chinese pressure, could say, we're prepared to allow all non-NPT countries to join, but Pakistan will have to wait a year or two until they fulfill the necessary steps that are needed. India is ready, India comes in first, but Pakistan, when it does the necessary, will follow.
That's perfectly reasonable. I think they'll have to wait a lot longer than 1 or 2 years.
But that sequential permission of both to enter is possible?
If you take a criteria-based approach, which is what China is saying, I don't think India in principle has an opposition to a criteria-based approach. The question is India's criteria India's credentials are far stronger. Yeah? India has aligned its export controls with the NSG voluntarily. Its proliferation record is much better than Pakistan's, I think, needless to say. And it actually has the support of almost all the members of the NSG to enter. So India's credentials are far stronger. India is India, Pakistan is Pakistan. The idea, I mean, to say that there's an India-specific waiver just because, for the sake of it, I think is a hard argument to make. But having a set of criteria and saying that anybody who meets that, hypothetically, should be able to join the NSG. India happens to meet those criteria now. Who knows, Israel, Pakistan, somebody else might down the road.
So let me pick up on that. If a criteria-specific waiver were to be agreed at Seoul, is it possible that through sequencing, because India is ready and its credentials are there and Pakistan is not, that they could let India in now and say the door is open to Pakistan when Pakistan does the necessary, but Pakistan has to do the necessary first? Would that be acceptable to China, and could that be a way out of this present impasse?
Well, the two things here. A criteria is not going to be evolved between today and Friday. That means you postpone a decision and you put it in the lap of a committee of experts or something like that.
And then you don't know what the outcome is.
Right. So therefore, the idea of sequential admission is something which we have talked about, because that is exactly what Secretary Kerry wrote in his letter, and that's what Sushma Swaraj, Foreign Minister, said in a press conference, where she said, we will not obstruct or we will not block Pakistan, let Pakistan's case be decided on merits.
But that can't happen between now and Friday.
No.
Sartaj Varadarajan, yesterday Sartaj Aziz said, and he is virtually Pakistan's foreign minister, that Pakistan has successfully blocked India's bid to the NSG. Does that mean that Pakistan has got some sort of assurance from Beijing that Beijing will not change its mind at the last moment, which is what Beijing did do in 2008?
I think, even if China gave Sartaj Aziz that kind of assurance, there's no reason why China cannot go back on it. But I think they would have made a fairly strong impression on Sartaj Aziz's mind that this time around the stakes are higher. The nature of the US-China relationship is different. The nature of even the China-India relationship is different. So 2008 and 2014 can't be compared. And I think there's if you're a gambling man, Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping can't be compared. There's good reason if you're a Pakistani gambling man to assume that if that's what the Chinese said, they will stick to that position. I have to say that the issue of criteria, just to come back to what Dhruva Jaishankar was saying, I think India has tied itself in knots somewhat, because for the last 2 weeks, the readout of the record from senior MEA officials has been that India does not favor a criteria-based approach. India favors a so-called merit-based approach. And I think that this has muddied the water somewhat by standing out against criteria which perhaps now India may be forced to accept, and that's finally what emerges as the compromise. But I think more importantly, we have wasted something like 5 or 6 years in not having a clear stand or clear position on what, how India would look at Pakistan's aspiration to be a part of the NSG or even to get a waiver. One of the first things that Pranab Mukherjee said after 2008, when he was asked about Pakistan, was that, well, if Pakistan were to have a discussion with the NSG and apply for a waiver, and the NSG were to look at conditions, India would encourage that. Somewhere down the line, the MEA and the government of India abandoned that position. Rather than exploring what should have been or what would have been a fruitful avenue, I think that would have helped improve relations with Pakistan and with China, and would have spared us this painful negotiations that we've seen over the last 2 or 3 weeks.
Okay.
We are now scrambling to reassure the world that yes, we don't mind if Pakistan comes on board. What we should have been doing in the past 6 years is actually discussing what those criteria ought to be. So if India went through several hoops because of its rather excellent record, Pakistan would have to go through many more hoops because its record is much worse.
Absolutely.
That conversation, that discussion, alas, hasn't happened. And it's largely our fault that we never encouraged the NSG to have that debate or that conversation.
Now, as things stand today, and as things perhaps will look over the next 2 days, a lot depends upon the meeting Prime Minister Modi will have with President Xi Jinping in Tashkent tomorrow. Can one such meeting between the two heads of government really change the situation? Or is this just the media and perhaps the Indian Foreign Service investing a lot of hope in a last desperate gamble?
I think I wouldn't want to speculate. Who knows? But on a matter like this, it would be national policy, and there would have to be very major inducements given for China suddenly to change its mind, to abandon its only ally as Pakistan is.
Do we have such inducements to throw in China's direction?
Well, something that's been speculated in the media is China's interest in the MTCR, which we are now in a position to block. So if that is something that China has set its heart on, as we seem to have set our heart on the NSG, yes, that's a trade-off.
In these circumstances, Dhruv Jaishankar, do you believe President Obama will pick up the phone and speak to Xi Jinping the way Bush did in 2008? And secondly, even if he is prepared to pick up the phone, will it have the same effect?
I can't speculate on that specific conversation. That may or may not happen.
Do you think it's possible or likely?
Who knows? We live in extraordinary times in many ways. But what I can say is it's quite clear that the United States has been very active in lobbying on India's behalf. And is very invested in now diplomatically in India's entry to the
Can I interrupt there? Up till now, we know of letters written by Secretary of State Kerry, and we know of statements made by spokespersons both in the White House and Foggy Bottom. But we don't know of any specific effort made by the president himself, and that's the big difference in 2008.
Well, we don't know. And actually, we didn't know. Even in 2008, we didn't know at the time. It came out subsequently, very soon after the fact, that there had been a lot of lobbying on the part of the Secretary of State and the president himself in the hours even leading up to the NSG meeting, and as the NSG meeting was taking place. But so we may find out after the fact that there's been a certain amount of.
There is room for a pleasant surprise.
There is room, but equally we could see that that may not be necessary, and or the U.S. president may just simply not be as invested this time. I mean, it will be in some ways a test of how much Obama has invested in the relationship with India. He's made it clear that he is very much so, but we'll see.
What about, Mr. Sood, countries other than China? Countries like Turkey, Ireland, Austria, New Zealand, have we got their support, or are there still steps we need to take to win them over fully?
Well, I think that these countries were also a little unhappy because of the arm twisting that took place in 2008. But if they have difficulties with admitting, because they have a rather purist view on NPT or non-proliferation, and if they have difficulties on that ground in accepting India joining the NSG, then they will really have to hold their nose when it comes to a decision on Pakistan. So my feeling is that these countries will probably come around. But on China, it is also a question that Prime Minister Modi, I think one thing is clear, he believes a lot in a personal style of diplomacy, and we've seen that he's tried to establish a personal rapport with other leaders, including President Xi Jinping. And so I think rather than President Obama picking up the phone, I think it is also a test for Prime Minister Modi's personal style of diplomacy that he invests in having built up a certain relationship with the Chinese leader. I mean, we saw that during...
So you're saying that the meeting they have in Tashkent tomorrow will be a test of Mr. Modi's ability, capacity to win over Xi Jinping?
Because he has invested a lot in developing that relationship. Because if you remember, when President Xi was in India, the two of them, that image of the two of them on the banks of Sabarmati in a swing together, or the image when Prime Minister Modi was in China of President Xi taking him around in Xi'an, showing him the terracotta warriors and so on, was all geared to, and we've seen that with other leaders as well, with President Obama.
This is pay time for the relationship. Rajan, at the moment, India's most senior, experienced official in charge of disarmament and nuclear issues, Amandeep Singh Gill, is already in Seoul. Television channels are speculating that the Foreign Secretary left last night and has joined him. Will this high-level presence add to the chances of success, or could it make failure more embarrassing?
No, I think, well, first of all, I think the Foreign Secretary is in fact there, so it's not a subject of speculation anymore. I think this shows resolve on India's part. I think since the government had invested a certain amount of political capital in a favorable outcome, I think the call has been taken to push as hard as can be done, even if failure results. So I think it was wise to send Jaishankar, because this has been made into a big issue, and if you back off now, then chances are that the Chinese will have their way in Seoul. Sending Jaishankar, reduces the possibility somewhat of China remaining fixed on its position. But I think what may be crucial is the connect between Modi and Xi Jinping. It is true that the Chinese have not won times.
Because what you just said, can I interrupt? What you just said about it being wise to send the Foreign Secretary sort of contradicts the answer you gave me to an earlier question when I said government sources are saying this is a sign that India is no longer afraid of failure, and you said that was guff.
No, I'm saying what is guff was their characterization of the earlier government as being timid. I don't think the previous government was afraid of failure. I don't think this government is afraid of failure, and I don't think in diplomacy governments or countries ought to be or should be afraid of failure. As I said, they have invested political energy in it, and in my view, somewhat unwisely. But having done so, it wouldn't make sense to withhold your trump cards, insofar as Mr. Jaishankar might be a trump card for the final round, or what may be or the penultimate round. So I think that this is something wise that they've done. But ultimately, whether Modi can swing Xi Jinping, get Xi Jinping to reverse a stand that has been reiterated as recently as this afternoon by the Chinese Foreign Ministry. Really, I don't have a clear sense of how the Chinese system works, whether Xi Jinping can simply wave a wand and all naysayers within the system melt away. The fact is that the Chinese, much more than in 2008, have taken a position, and walking away from that is not going to be easy. So perhaps, as there has been speculation on a plan B, some kind of a plan B emerging, maybe that's the best outcome that Jaishankar could produce, having gone all the way to Seoul.
Today's Times of India speculates that China's implacable opposition could lead other NSG countries to look for a sort of compromise, perhaps send the matter to a committee or to a panel that will take a year or maybe even longer to work out some sort of acceptable solution. Would that be the most dreadful outcome, because then we'll be stuck in limbo for a year or more? Or would that be the beginning of an answer, even if it takes time?
Well, there are two outcomes. One is that the sequential approach which we have already talked about, which has been conveyed to the NSG members. Namely, we will not object to Pakistan's membership coming up in due course, as in when it has done its preparatory work, and we get in a decision regarding India is taken, a positive decision.
Secretary of State Kerry underlined that in his letter.
Absolutely. So that is one way in which it goes. That's a positive decision from India's point of view. Any other decision, a postponement, is negative, because what it means very simply is it means India is hyphenated with Pakistan, which means that A, it puts it into a time frame which is not possible to define at this stage, and B, it will happen when India and Pakistan will get admitted together, which means China's strategic objective gets met.
The second option that you heard from Mr. Sood is in fact your great fear of India being hyphenated with Pakistan. How likely is it that the second option, rather than the sequential option which suits India, would be the outcome? Well, if it goes to a panel and if it goes to a committee?
No, if it goes to a committee, the committee will obviously look at both together. If the first option is the one that is taken, it will be a political decision taken by the plenary. It depends very much on how strongly the support for India is put forward by those in the NSG who back India's case. Personally, of course, I believe it doesn't really matter either way, that if India does get admitted now, which is the best case scenario for us, we are simply, quite ridiculously, accepting a second-class membership, because India would be the only member, a full member of the NSG, against whom there would be restriction on trade.
And that is the restriction of reprocessing and enrichment.
And it's ridiculous that you enter a club knowing that you're only being given partial rights.
Which is in fact why you began by saying that in fact this is a misplaced, mistaken quest. But leave that aside, because that's a discussion we had earlier. What are the chances that if India can ensure countries like Turkey, Austria, New Zealand fall on our side, and China is isolated, that China will agree to a solution like a sequential solution which suits India at the end of the day?
Well, there may be a number of other creative solutions that will be found. I don't think there will be an absence of creativity in the next few days. But so I'm not sure that it's exactly so binary, the outcomes. From India's point of view, in fact, the window of opportunity right now, I mean, the reason why there's been a push right now is because President Obama has expressed an interest in backing India in India's entry into the NSG. Therefore, the window really closes with President Obama's departure.
We're not confident that a Hillary presidency will give us the same support?
No, perhaps, but I doubt it will be a high priority for her, and a new government, a new administration in the US will take many months.
So it's now or never?
I don't think now or never. If it happens in the next 6 months, or it's pushed off several years. But I do think we shouldn't think of the Seoul meeting as the final a final determinative meeting. There may be other circumstances in the next few months.
Very quickly on that point, if it were to be sent to a committee or a panel and they consider the two options that you mentioned, could they actually conclude their deliberations before President Obama demits office, or is that unlikely?
Very unlikely.
So, in other words, once it goes to a panel, it will take
It
over
has
6
its
months.
own dynamics and a 48-member panel, because I think since they take their decisions by consensus, so what you, and even if you were to create a smaller panel, it would, the decision or recommendation by
Would
the
have to go
smaller
back to the full body.
would have to go back to all 48. And incidentally, I mean, I think we haven't spent enough time about Turkey's objections, and I don't know if we've done enough to overcome Turkey's objections, because Turkey and Pakistan also have a long-standing relationship.
Except that there was a suggestion in an interview that the Turkish ambassador in Delhi gave the Times of India that he is open to India, or his country is open to India joining on a criteria-based basis, which would perhaps open the door for Pakistan as well.
But criteria is shorthand for shelving a decision today and postponing it to a later date.
Which doesn't suit us at all. Siddharth Varadarajan, there's one other aspect to what could be happening in Seoul. Is this in some sense developing into a China versus USA standoff over India's membership? And if it is in some sense going that way, would a Chinese victory diminish American standing, particularly perhaps in the Asia-Pacific area?
You know, I think there is an element of US-China rivalry, and I think that the Chinese stand this time around is linked to their perception of India having drawn very close to the US over the last 2 years. I don't agree with Dhruva Jaishankar that Obama and the US are actively or working very hard to see this through, which is why I don't think failure to admit India and Seoul will be a huge setback for the US. India is doing most of the major campaigning and lifting, and you know, I don't think the US is that invested in seeing this through this time, quite frankly. But you know, for us, if it doesn't happen, if a committee is set up, you know, it's very hard to predict what kind of outcome would come up. You know, India would have to salvage the best of what is a bad deal. You know, don't forget that in 2008, we were present at every stage of those negotiations, even though we weren't in the room. But the conditions on which India accepted the waiver, you know, this was negotiated between India and various countries. How will this committee, if that's what the NSG sets up, how will it do its business when it's going to consider the application not of one country outside the NPT, but 3, if you look at Pakistan, India and Israel? You know, it's a complicated process. It would be far easier, in my view, for India to cash in on its relationship with Latin America, get the treaty for the for nuclear weapons free zone in Latin America, which is the Treaty of Tlatelolco, to be amended to allow India to sign that treaty, and then knock on the NSG's doors and say, look, your rules say NPT or Latin America nuclear weapons free zone or any other equivalent treaty, we are paid up members. So that would seem to me a far more easy option than to pass through the various obstacles that this kind of committee.
I've got someone in studio disagreeing with you. It's Rakesh Sood, who's an expert on these treaties. Very quickly, why do you disagree?
Well, very simply because signing the Treaty of Tlatelolco, Latin America Nuclear Weapon Free Zone, implies that those countries acknowledge us as a nuclear weapon state in terms of the fact that we provide a certain security assurance. And that goes contrary to the NPT definition, and because they are all members of the NPT, they will not do that.
Let me try and get to what is an issue that hasn't been discussed. American support for India, particularly if President Obama picks up the phone and rings the Chinese, is not going to go down very well with Islamabad, and it's going to affect his relationship with Pakistan. Is he prepared to support India to the extent of upsetting Pakistan at a time when he needs Pakistan's help in fulfilling his hopes and plans for A, Afghanistan, and B, the treatment of Taliban? Would he run the risk of putting that into the balance?
I mean, my interpretation of this is US-Pakistan relations are in fact a lot worse than, I mean, we have a former Indian High Commissioner to Pakistan here, but currently...
Except that you've just come from Washington.
A few months ago, but US-Pakistan relations are far worse than either let on publicly beyond a point. And so I'm not sure that would really be a very big concern. I mean, I think if anything it would echo what George W. Bush said standing next to President Musharraf, that we should treat India on its merits and Pakistan on its merits, when Musharraf raised the prospect of Pakistan being offered a similar nuclear agreement to the one that the US and India had. So I don't see this as adding significantly to the current amount of distrust between the US and Pakistan.
In other words, also President Obama won't worry too much if he does that extra little bit to help India, that Pakistan will get offended.
And I would also just one thing. I mean, I think we shouldn't frame this necessarily as a US versus China thing. I mean, we do have 44 odd countries supporting India here. So it's not simply a US versus China, it's 44 versus 1 or 45 versus 1.
Let me put the downside before I come to the upside. If India fails to get in, will it be a big setback, even possibly a defeat for Mr. Modi, given the effort he's put into it?
Yes, I think it was perhaps unwise for the government to invest as much of its prestige as it has. And therefore, something that is quite trivial in terms of India's strategic interests has now seems taken on the cast of something extremely important. And because we seem to be so invested in success, failure would naturally have its repercussions.
And would that repercussion be felt not just domestically in the press and with the opposition, but internationally? Would it affect India's standing internationally?
I am not terribly sure that too many people are interested in what's happening in the NSG. I think the failure would be here in India, that we've gone all out and we've failed.
So it would be a domestic thing rather than something that affects India's standing or Mr. Modi's standing personally?
Largely domestic, I would think.
There is, of course, always the possibility of the upside, and in all fairness, we mustn't ignore that. If India does get in, will that be a huge victory and one personally for Mr. Modi, because he's made a huge effort?
Well, if India does get in, then it is really Mr. Modi's victory, because as I said, he has invested in personal diplomacy, and it would be that meeting in Tashkent which would enable a change in the Chinese position.
So this would be a big feather in his personal cap?
Well, yes, certainly, and it would also mean that he is the one, whereas the previous government had gotten a waiver, Prime Minister Modi is the one who has brought India into the nuclear suppliers group. Then this whole business of the nuclear high table will get highlighted again and again.
Siddharth Rajan, many people believe that the Prime Minister emerges from this effort to get into the NSG, regardless of whether we succeed or fail, as a man who has determination, as a man who's prepared to take risks, and who has the confidence to take them all the way, even when potentially they could lead to failure. Does that show him up in a different light to his predecessors? And by different, I mean a complementary light? That he doesn't shy away from challenges? Or is that an unfair conclusion?
Look, I think the problem with the previous government is not that it shied away from challenges, but that there was very little energy in Manmohan Singh himself as an individual, his capacity to travel, his willingness to open multiple fronts of engagement. Mr. Modi has undoubtedly brought greater energy, and I think he has to be given credit for that. I don't think this government is more or less capable or more or less willing to pursue difficult challenges than the previous one. I think this is the Indian system as a whole has always looked forward to enlarging the area of operation for the country, the room for maneuver of the country, and this is something that Modi has taken forward. But there is an element of event management in a lot of the diplomatic outreach that he's done, and I think somewhere down the line, some of this is aimed at securing political advantage at home. And as I said at the start, that it's important that you have diplomatic goals, strategic goals that drive your foreign policy, rather than being over about what the domestic outcome of this is going to be. And I think that's where I would fault the Prime Minister somewhat, that there's a lot of preoccupation with the domestic image management here that is operating.
Dhrumja Shankar, if we don't get in, will this have implications for India's relationship with China? Because China will clearly have been the obstacle that stopped us.
Absolutely. I mean, but just to address I actually completely agree with Siddharth Varadarajan, which is, if India does see success in the next few years, Prime Minister Modi's backers will promote it as a big personal triumph. If he fails, his opponents will frame this as a big personal disaster. I would say neither is as true as as it should be. He's building upon work done by the previous government, and it would be, I mean, it would obviously be a good thing, but I'm sensing that this will be an issue that will be politicized either way, and it need not be so politicized.
To come to my question about the implications for India-China relations if we don't get it.
I think the very fact that we're talking about it in the Indian media to such an extent is indicative of the fact that people are paying attention to it, and that China is seen as the primary adversarial force on the NSG. So I mean, it will certainly at the minimum come at a great loss of a reputational cost for China in India, in the public eye, within government, as the primary force blocking India's entry to a multilateral government. And so what exactly will follow after that, I think, remains to be seen.
Absolutely.
But I mean, I don't think it'll come without costs.
Satyapal, if we don't get in, will it take the gloss of India-US relations, and in particular, will it change the image and impression we have that Obama is a buddy of Narendra Modi?
No, I don't think so at all, because the US is doing what it can, but on this the US is one among 48, and though it certainly can do much heavier lifting than others can, on this, if you have China and a few others who are in the background opposing India, then there's only so much the US can do. I don't think there'll be any impact on India-US relations.
Finally, Mr. Sood, the NSG issue has become a very high-profile issue in the media. I know that the Indo-US nuclear deal was equally high-profile, but that was a different time and a different set of circumstances. Was the government ill-advised to let it become such a high-profile issue? And in particular, was the foreign minister ill-advised to attempt to downplay the opposition from China and to suggest that, in fact, there was no opposition from there, and to even suggest, as she almost did, that India would get in?
Well, I think she was trying to create a little room for possible diplomatic efforts, considering that the foreign secretary is in Seoul and Prime Minister Modi is going to have this bilateral meeting with President Xi, which I'm sure foreign minister would have known about. However, the fact that this was made into a high-profile visit, high-profile issue on media, and so much was invested into it, I think is a bit of a miscalculation, for the simple reason, particularly when we saw the Pakistanis putting in their application. I mean, at that stage, we should have been able to calculate that Pakistan is doing this in concert with China with a view to blocking India or pushing or hyphenating. And I think after that, the effort that we've put in and the kind of publicity that it has got and the profile it has got in national media is what has made it into an issue where, if China does not play ball, in other words, China does not accept the sequential approach, namely India getting in now and subsequently Pakistan, then I'm afraid there is a certain degree of animus that would creep into the relationship and have a downturn.
What a delightful story this is. Who would have thought that high politics would have the flavor of a, not quite murder mystery, but certainly a crime whodunit. Every moment seems to be riveting to watch. My thanks to all three of you for coming to studio. My thanks to Siddharth Varadarajan for joining us. And if you have been, thanks for watching. Goodbye. Good night.